The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's firing range as Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez adjusted her grip on the M4 carbine. What started as routine marksmanship training was about to become the most talked about incident in the base's recent history. In the span of 15 shots, Maria would not only defend her reputation, but redefine what everyone thought they knew about precision shooting under pressure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The tension had been building for weeks. Sergeant First Class Rick Morrison had made it his personal mission to undermine Maria's credibility ever since she'd been selected for the elite marksmanship instructor program. Morrison, a 20-year veteran with a chest full of ribbons and an ego to match, couldn't stomach the idea that a woman, particularly one 10 years his junior, had earned a spot that he believed should have been his. Lucky shots, he'd mutter whenever Maria's scores were posted. Range queens always fold when it matters. His comments weren't just casual observations. They were calculated attacks designed to chip away at Maria's confidence and standing among the troops. But Morrison had severely underestimated who he was dealing with. Maria Elena Gonzalez had grown up on a ranch outside San Antonio, where her grandfather had taught her to shoot tin cans off fence posts before she could properly hold a rifle. "Mija," he'd say in his weathered voice, "shooting isn't about the gun. It's about becoming one with your breath, your heartbeat, your intention." Those words had carried her through basic training, through multiple deployments, and through every challenge the Army had thrown her way. By the time she enlisted at 18, Maria could outshoot most of her male counterparts without breaking a sweat. But she'd learned early that skill alone wasn't enough. She needed to be twice as good to get half the recognition. So she worked harder, stayed later at the range, studied ballistics in her spare time, and never let anyone see her sweat. Her dedication paid off when she was selected for advanced marksmanship training and later recommended for the instructor program. The selection hadn't been without controversy. Morrison had lobbied hard for the position, citing his experience and what he called his natural leadership qualities. When the decision was announced, his reaction was swift and brutal. He began a whisper campaign, suggesting that Maria's selection was the result of diversity quotas rather than merit. The accusations stung because Maria knew that some people believed them, despite her consistently superior performance. The morning of the incident, the quarterly marksmanship evaluation was scheduled. Every soldier in the unit would be tested on various shooting scenarios, from basic rifle proficiency to advanced tactical situations. Maria was serving as one of the evaluators, a responsibility that came with her instructor certification. She'd arrived early to inspect the equipment and prepare the range, her usual routine of checking every rifle, counting ammunition, and ensuring all safety protocols were in place. Morrison arrived with his squad, swagger intact and voice carrying across the range as he regaled his men with stories of combat heroics. Back in Afghanistan, he announced loud enough for Maria to hear, "We didn't have time for fancy shooting techniques. Real combat is about getting rounds downrange fast, not playing games on a controlled range." The comment was clearly directed at her, another attempt to diminish her expertise by suggesting that range shooting wasn't real military skill. Maria had heard variations of this argument countless times, usually from men who felt threatened by her abilities. She'd learned to let most comments slide, but Morrison's relentless campaign was beginning to wear on her. As the evaluations began, Morrison's performance was adequate but unremarkable. He hit his targets consistently, enough to pass, but his groupings were loose and his time scores were mediocre. When Maria offered constructive feedback, part of her job as an instructor, he bristled visibly. "I've been shooting since before you were born, little girl," he snapped, his voice carrying across the firing line. "Maybe focus on your own lane instead of trying to teach real soldiers how to fight." The range fell silent. Every eye turned toward Maria, waiting to see how she would respond. She could feel the weight of expectation, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Would she stand her ground or back down? This wasn't just about one sergeant's attitude. It was about her credibility, her authority, and her right to wear the instructor's badge she'd earned. Maria's response was measured but firm. "Sergeant Morrison, I'm providing feedback to help you improve your score. That's my job as your instructor. Your current grouping has room for improvement, and I'm here to help you achieve that." Morrison's face flushed red. 20 years of military service, 3 combat deployments, and a wall full of commendations, and he was being corrected by someone he saw as an upstart. His pride couldn't handle it, and his next words would set in motion a chain of events that no one present would ever forget. "You think you're some kind of hotshot because you can hit paper targets?" Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Let me tell you something, sweetheart. When the bullets start flying for real, you'll be crying for someone like me to save your ass." The range remained deadly quiet as Morrison's words hung in the air like gun smoke. Maria felt every pair of eyes on her, measuring her reaction, waiting to see if she would crumble under the pressure or rise to meet the challenge. She had faced this moment countless times before, the moment when someone decided to test whether she really belonged in their world. "Is that right, Sergeant Morrison?" Maria's voice was steady, professional, but there was steel underneath. "You think my qualifications are inadequate?" Morrison sensed he had an audience and decided to press his advantage. "I think you've had it easy, playing instructor here on the safe little range. I think when push comes to shove, you'll fold like a house of cards." He gestured dismissively at the targets downrange. "Anyone can shoot when there's no pressure, when nobody's shooting back." What Morrison didn't know was that Maria had been under fire more times than he assumed. Her deployment records were classified, but she'd spent 18 months with a Special Operations Support Unit, providing overwatch and precision fire support in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. She'd taken shots that mattered, saved lives with her rifle, and done it all without fanfare or recognition. But she didn't need to justify herself to Morrison or anyone else. "I see," Maria said calmly. "So you're saying that marksmanship under pressure is what really matters?" Morrison's chest puffed out. "Damn right it is. Real shooting isn't about perfect conditions and unlimited time. It's about performance when everything's going to hell around you." Maria nodded thoughtfully, then looked around at the assembled soldiers. "Would you be interested in a demonstration, Sergeant Morrison? A little test of shooting under pressure?" The question caught Morrison off guard. He expected her to back down, maybe file a complaint, or at worst get into a shouting match. He hadn't expected her to escalate. "What kind of demonstration?" "A challenge." Maria's voice carried across the range, ensuring everyone could hear. "You set the conditions. Make it as stressful as you want, within safety regulations. Then we'll see who really knows how to shoot when it counts." A murmur ran through the assembled soldiers. This was unprecedented. Instructors typically didn't engage in shooting contests with students, especially not in front of an audience. But Morrison had pushed things too far, and Maria had decided that sometimes the only way to end a challenge was to meet it head-on. Morrison's eyes lit up with what he thought was opportunity. He was confident in his abilities, and he figured that even if Maria could shoot, the pressure of a public challenge would rattle her enough to give him the advantage he needed. "You're on, hotshot, but let's make it interesting." "I'm listening," Maria replied. Morrison looked around the range, his mind working. 15 shots, mixed distances. But here's the catch. We'll do it with physical stressors, push-ups, sprints, whatever it takes to get the heart rate up and the hands shaking. Then we shoot. Most accurate grouping wins. Maria considered the proposal. It was exactly the kind of machismo-driven test she had expected from Morrison. All about proving who was tougher, who could handle more stress. But it played to her strengths more than he realized. Her training had included extensive work on shooting while physically exhausted, controlling breathing and heartbeat under extreme conditions. Agreed, she said. But let's add one more element to really test skill under pressure. Morrison's eyebrow raised. What do you have in mind? Maria pointed to the rifle in his hands. We use your rifle. Same ammunition, same conditions for both of us. That way there's no question about equipment advantages. It was a brilliant move. By suggesting they use Morrison's rifle, she eliminated any potential argument about her having superior equipment. She was literally going to beat him with his own gun, using his own ammunition, under conditions he had chosen. The psychological impact on Morrison would be devastating. Morrison hesitated for just a moment. Something about Maria's confidence was unsettling, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Fine, my rifle, my ammo, but when you embarrass yourself out there, don't come crying about it later. I won't, Maria assured him. Staff Sergeant Jenkins, the range safety officer, stepped forward. He'd been watching the confrontation with growing concern, but he recognized that this had moved beyond a simple disagreement. Both soldiers were committed now, and trying to stop it would only create more problems. If we're doing this, he announced, we do it by the book. Full safety protocols, proper spotting, and I call the shots on conditions. Maria and Morrison both nodded their agreement. First phase, 50 push-ups, quarter-mile sprint, then immediate shooting. 15 rounds at varying distances, 5 rounds each at 100 meters, 200 meters, and 300 meters. Best grouping wins. He looked between the two competitors. Last chance to back out. Neither moved. The assembled soldiers formed a loose circle around the starting point. Word was spreading quickly through the base that something extraordinary was happening on Range 7. Officers and NCOs began appearing, drawn by the unusual commotion and the promise of seeing something they'd never witnessed before. Morrison stripped off his jacket and handed his rifle to Maria. "Ladies first," he said with a smirk that didn't quite hide his nervousness. Maria accepted the weapon and quickly inspected it. The rifle was well maintained, but showed signs of heavy use. The scope was properly zeroed, but she could tell from the wear patterns that Morrison favored certain positions over others. She made mental notes about the rifle's balance and characteristics as she prepared for what was about to unfold. The crowd continued to grow as Maria began her physical preparation. Word had spread through the base like wildfire. The new marksmanship instructor was about to face off against one of the unit's most vocal skeptics in a shooting competition that would settle the question of her abilities once and for all. Officers emerged from administrative buildings, mechanics wiped their hands clean and jogged over from the motor pool, and even some of the base's civilian contractors found excuses to witness what was shaping up to be an epic confrontation. Maria positioned herself at the starting line, Morrison's rifle secured across her back in proper carry position. She began her mental preparation routine, the same process she'd used before every important shot during her deployment. First, she centered her breathing, feeling her heart rate stabilize. Then she visualized the course ahead, 50 push-ups to engage her core and shoulders, a quarter-mile sprint to elevate her heart rate and challenge her cardiovascular system, then the immediate transition to precision shooting while her body was still in recovery mode. "Ready when you are, Sergeant Gonzalez," Staff Sergeant Jenkins called out, his stopwatch in hand. Maria dropped into push-up position. The ground was hard-packed dirt and gravel, standard for military training ranges. As she began the first rep, she could hear Morrison's voice carrying over the crowd noise, still playing to his audience. "Watch how she handles the real stress," he was saying. "Paper targets don't shoot back, and push-ups aren't combat conditions, but at least it's something more than standing around in perfect weather." Maria tuned him out completely. She'd learned years ago that dealing with doubt and negativity was as much a part of marksmanship as understanding ballistics. Every repetition was controlled and precise, down until her chest nearly touched the ground, up until her arms were fully extended. No wasted energy, No showing off, just efficient movement designed to stress her muscles without exhausting her completely. At the 25 repetition mark, she could feel the burn beginning in her shoulders and triceps. This was exactly what Morrison was counting on: muscle fatigue that would affect her ability to hold the rifle steady. But Maria's training had prepared her for this. She'd done thousands of push-ups in her career, many of them followed immediately by shooting drills. Her body knew how to manage the transition from physical exertion to fine motor control. 35, 36, 37. Jenkins counted off each rep, ensuring there could be no dispute about Maria meeting the challenge requirements. Around the circle, soldiers were placing informal bets. Most of them had never seen Maria shoot under pressure, so they were gambling based on reputation and instinct rather than hard evidence. The smart money seemed to be on Morrison. He was known, tested, and had the credibility that came with years of service. But there were a few quiet voices expressing confidence in the instructor who had impressed them during recent training sessions. 48, 49, 50, Jenkins called out. Move to the sprint. Maria popped up from her final push-up and immediately began jogging toward the quarter-mile marker. This was where she had a hidden advantage. Morrison was assuming that the sprint would wind her, but he didn't know about her background in cross-country running during high school and college. While she wasn't in the same shape she'd been in at 19, she still maintained the efficient stride and breathing patterns that would let her cover the distance quickly without completely exhausting her oxygen reserves. As she rounded the final turn and approached the finish line, she could see the shooting positions that had been prepared during her run. Jenkins and his assistants had set up 3 shooting stations, prone positions at the 100, 200, and 300-meter marks, each with sandbags for support and clear sightlines to the appropriate targets. Time, Jenkins called out as Maria crossed the finish line. 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Outstanding time, Sergeant Gonzalez. Ready for the shooting phase? Maria was breathing hard, but not gasping. Her heart rate was elevated. She could feel it pounding in her chest, but she wasn't in distress. This was the sweet spot she'd trained for, physically challenged but not overwhelmed, alert and focused despite the stress her body was experiencing. Ready when you are, Sergeant Gonzalez, she replied, unslinging Morrison's rifle and beginning her final preparations for the shooting phase that would determine the outcome of this very public challenge.
Maria approached the first firing position at 100 meters, Morrison's rifle in her hands feeling foreign, yet familiar. Every weapon had its own personality, subtle differences in trigger pull, balance points, and recoil characteristics that could make or break a shot under pressure. She had perhaps 30 seconds to familiarize herself with this particular rifle before she would need to deliver 5 precision shots while her heart was still hammering from the sprint. The crowd had positioned themselves safely behind the firing line, creating an amphitheater of expectant faces. Maria could feel their attention like a physical weight, but she'd learned long ago to channel external pressure into focus rather than letting it become distraction. As she settled into the prone position, she began her breathing routine. Deep inhales through her nose, controlled exhales through slightly parted lips, each breath cycle bringing her closer to the calm center she needed for accurate shooting. Target confirmed, 100 meters, Jenkins announced. 5 rounds, precision fire. Shooter ready? Maria adjusted her position, finding the natural point of aim where the rifle wanted to rest. The sandbags provided support, but she knew better than to rely too heavily on them. True marksmanship came from becoming one with the weapon, creating a stable platform with her body that could deliver consistent results regardless of external support. Ready, she called out. Send it. The first shot surprised even Maria with its smooth release. Despite the elevated heart rate and residual muscle tension from the physical challenge, the rifle settled naturally into her shoulder, the scope picture was clear and steady, and the trigger broke cleanly at exactly the right moment. Through the scope, she could see the bullet strike, not quite center, but well within the inner rings of the target. The second shot followed quickly, her body automatically cycling through the bolt action and settling back into position. This time, she adjusted slightly for the rifle's particular characteristics, compensating for what she'd learned from the first round. The bullet punched through the target just millimeters from center. By the third shot, Maria had entered what shooters call the zone, that mental state where conscious thought gives way to trained instinct. where the rifle becomes an extension of the body rather than a separate tool. Her breathing, heartbeat, and trigger control synchronized into a perfect rhythm that delivered the bullet exactly where her mind intended it to go. Shot 4 was perfect center. Shot 5 was so close to shot 4 that the holes nearly overlapped. "Ceasefire," Jenkins called out. "Outstanding shooting, Sergeant Gonzalez. Moving to 200 meters. The applause from the crowd was spontaneous and genuine. Even soldiers who had been skeptical of Maria's abilities couldn't argue with what they'd just witnessed. Shooting 5 tight groups at 100 meters wasn't impossible, but doing it immediately after physical exertion while using an unfamiliar rifle was genuinely impressive. Morrison's expression had shifted from confident smugness to something approaching concern. He'd expected Maria to perform adequately. She was, after all, a certified instructor. But the precision he'd just witnessed was beyond what he'd anticipated. Still, he told himself, 100 meters wasn't that challenging for any competent shooter. The real test would come at longer distances, where small errors in technique became magnified into significant misses. "Nice grouping," he called out as Maria moved to the 200-meter position. "Let's see how you handle some real distance." Maria didn't respond. She was already transitioning into preparation mode for the next phase, analyzing wind conditions and light angles that would affect bullet trajectory over the extended range. At 200 meters, factors that were negligible at closer distances became critical variables that could determine success or failure. The prone position at 200 meters required slight adjustments. The shooting mat was positioned differently, the sandbags were configured for the new angle and distance, and the target itself appeared significantly smaller through the scope. Maria took her time getting settled, ignoring the murmurs from the audience who might interpret her careful preparation as nervousness. Actually, Maria's deliberate approach was evidence of her experience and training. Inexperienced shooters often rush their setup, eager to get to the shooting phase, but professionals understood that the quality of preparation directly determined the quality of results. Every second spent perfecting her position and sight picture was an investment in accuracy that would pay dividends when the shots counted. "Target confirmed, 200 meters, Jenkins announced. 5 rounds, precision fire. Take your time, Sergeant." Through her scope, she could see the target clearly, but it appeared noticeably smaller than it had at 100 meters. The wind had picked up slightly, just enough to introduce a variable that would need to be calculated and compensated for. She watched the grass around the target area, looking for patterns in the vegetation that would tell her which direction the wind was blowing and how consistently. The first shot at 200 meters required her to demonstrate real marksmanship skill. The physical stress from the earlier exercise was still affecting her fine motor control. Her heart rate hadn't completely returned to normal, and she was working with an unfamiliar rifle whose ballistic characteristics she was still learning. But as she settled behind the weapon and found her natural point of aim, Maria felt the familiar confidence that came from years of training and experience. The shot broke cleanly, and through the scope, she could see another hit in the center rings. Not quite center, but well within the extant marksmanship standards for this distance.
Shot after shot, Maria continued to demonstrate the kind of precision that comes only from countless hours of dedicated practice and natural talent refined through professional training. Her second shot at 200 meters landed just adjacent to the first, creating the beginning of what marksmen call a ragged hole, multiple bullets passing through virtually the same point on the target. The crowd had grown quieter as they realized they were witnessing something exceptional. Initial skepticism had given way to genuine admiration, and even some of Morrison's most vocal supporters were beginning to acknowledge that they were watching a masterclass in precision shooting. Morrison himself was struggling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, his ego demanded that he find fault with Maria's performance, dismiss it somehow as luck or favorable conditions. On the other hand, his 20 years of military experience had taught him to recognize genuine skill when he saw it, and what Maria was displaying was undeniably the real thing. "She's shooting my rifle better than I do," he muttered to himself, a comment that several nearby soldiers overheard and filed away for later discussion. Maria's third shot at 200 meters was slightly off-center, and for a moment Morrison's hopes rose. But then she made a small adjustment to her position, compensating for what she'd learned from that round, and her fourth shot was back in the center ring. It was a perfect demonstration of how professional marksmen use feedback from each shot to improve their performance throughout a string of fire. The fifth shot at 200 meters completed another tight grouping that would have been impressive under normal circumstances, much less after physical exertion while using an unfamiliar weapon. Jenkins called ceasefire and announced the transition to 300 meters, the final and most challenging phase of Maria's demonstration. 300 meters represented a significant escalation in difficulty. At this distance, small errors in shooting technique became magnified into clear misses. Wind effects became much more pronounced. The target appeared substantially smaller through the scope, requiring precise sight alignment and trigger control that many recreational shooters never master. Moreover, the physical and mental stress of the competition was beginning to accumulate. Even well-trained athletes experience fatigue after extended periods of high performance, and Maria had been operating at peak concentration for over 20 minutes. Her breathing and heart rate had stabilized, but maintaining perfect focus while surrounded by dozens of observers was mentally exhausting in its own way. As she moved to the 300-meter position, Maria noticed that Morrison had grown quieter. His earlier commentary and casual dismissals had stopped, replaced by a focused attention that suggested he was finally taking her seriously as a competitor. This shift in his attitude was actually more challenging than his initial hostility. Doubt and disrespect were easy to ignore, but genuine concern from a fellow professional required a different kind of mental management. The 300-meter shooting position had been set up with extra care by Jenkins and his assistants. The sandbags were positioned precisely, the shooting mat was aligned for optimal body position, and the sight line to the target was clear of any potential obstructions. But even with perfect preparation, shooting at this distance would test every aspect of Maria's marksmanship skills. She took longer to settle into this final position, partly because the greater distance required more precise alignment, but also because she understood that these 5 shots would likely determine how the entire competition was remembered. Her performance at 100 and 200 meters had been impressive, but 300 meters would prove whether she could maintain that level of precision under maximum stress. Through her scope, the target appeared significantly smaller than it had at closer ranges. The standard military qualification target was designed to be challenging but achievable at 300 meters, but it required shooting skills that many soldiers struggled to develop. The wind had continued to pick up slightly, and Maria could see grass and vegetation around the target area moving in patterns that indicated variable wind conditions. "Take your time, Sergeant," Jenkins called out. "This is the championship round." Maria smiled slightly at his comment. She appreciated his recognition that this final phase would determine the outcome of the entire challenge, but she also felt confident in her preparation and training. 300 meters wasn't the longest shot she'd ever taken. During her deployment, she'd successfully engaged targets at much greater distances, but it would be the most public shot she'd ever attempted. She began her final breathing routine, settling deeper into the shooting position and finding the perfectly natural point of aim where the rifle wanted to rest. Her heart rate, which had been elevated throughout the competition, finally began to approach normal resting levels. Her hands, which had shown slight tremor from the earlier physical exertion, steadied completely. The first shot at 300 meters would be critical. It would establish her zero for this distance with this particular rifle, providing feedback that she could use to adjust subsequent shots if necessary. But it would also be psychological. A good first shot would build confidence for the remaining 4 rounds, while a poor first shot could create doubt that might affect her overall performance. Maria settled behind Morrison's rifle, placed her cheek against the stock in exactly the position that had worked for the previous 10 shots, and began her final sight picture alignment. The crosshairs in the scope settled naturally onto the target, wavering slightly with her breathing, but returning consistently to the same point of aim. She took a deep breath, let half of it out, and began the slow, steady trigger pull that would send the 11th shot of her demonstration downrange toward a target that seemed impossibly small and distant.
The trigger broke with surgical precision, and Maria felt the rifle's familiar recoil push back against her shoulder. Through the scope, she watched the bullet's impact, a perfect hit, center ring, exactly where she had intended it to go.
The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, but Maria was already cycling the bolt and preparing for her second shot at 300 meters. This was the moment when champions separated themselves from merely good shooters. Anyone could get lucky with one shot, even at extended distance, but consistency over multiple shots required a level of skill and mental control that few people ever achieved. Maria had 4 more rounds to prove that her first shot wasn't a fluke. Her second shot landed so close to the first that even with binoculars, observers had difficulty distinguishing between the 2 bullet holes. The grouping was beginning to look like the kind of precision that belonged in marksmanship textbooks, rather than spontaneous competitions on military ranges. Morrison was no longer making comments. He stood with his arms crossed, watching intently as Maria prepared for her third shot. His expression had evolved from skepticism to grudging respect to something approaching awe. In 20 years of military service, he had never seen shooting like this, especially under pressure conditions with an unfamiliar weapon. Maria's third shot continued the pattern, another center hit that added to what was becoming a remarkably tight grouping. She was shooting Morrison's rifle more accurately than most people could shoot their own carefully tuned competition weapons under ideal conditions. The demonstration had moved beyond proving her competence. It was becoming a showcase of world-class marksmanship ability. "Jesus," someone in the crowd whispered. "She's putting them all in the same hole." The comment wasn't quite accurate. There was some spread in Maria's grouping, but it captured the essence of what everyone was witnessing. At 300 meters, after physical exertion, using someone else's rifle, Maria was achieving the kind of precision that most shooters only dreamed about. Her fourth shot at 300 meters was slightly off-center, creating a small gap in the otherwise tight grouping. For a moment, some observers wondered if the pressure was finally getting to her, if the mental stress of performing in front of so many people was beginning to affect her shooting. But Maria simply made a tiny adjustment to her position and prepared for her final shot with the same calm focus she had maintained throughout the entire demonstration. The fifth and final shot was perfect. Not just good, not just acceptable, but genuinely perfect. A bullseye that completed a grouping that would have been impressive from a bench rest under ideal conditions, much less after the physical and mental challenges Maria had endured. "Cease fire," Jenkins announced, his voice carrying a note of amazement that he wasn't trying to hide. "That concludes the shooting demonstration. Outstanding performance, Sergeant Gonzalez." The applause was thunderous and sustained. Soldiers who had arrived skeptical were now cheering for a performance they knew they would remember for years. Even the officers who had gathered to watch were nodding their approval and discussing what they had witnessed in terms normally reserved for Olympic-level athletic performances. But the most significant reaction came from Morrison himself. As Maria stood up from her final shooting position and began to safe the rifle, he approached her with an expression that was completely different from his earlier hostility and skepticism. "Sergeant Gonzalez," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the crowd noise, "I owe you an apology." The range fell quiet again, as everyone realized they were about to witness the conclusion of a confrontation that had been building for weeks. Morrison's next words would either escalate the situation further or finally put an end to the conflict that had created so much tension within the unit. "I was wrong about you," Morrison continued. "Dead wrong. What you just did with my rifle, I've never seen shooting like that in my entire career. You didn't just prove you can shoot, you proved you're one of the finest marksmen I've ever had the privilege to serve with." He extended his hand toward Maria, a gesture that represented far more than a simple handshake. It was an acknowledgement of her skill, a recognition of her right to wear the instructor's badge, and a public admission that his previous comments and attitude had been based on prejudice rather than performance. Maria accepted his handshake with grace and professionalism. "Thank you, Sergeant Morrison. I appreciate that." But Morrison wasn't finished. He turned to address the assembled crowd, many of whom were soldiers from his own unit who had heard his previous criticisms of Maria's qualifications. "I want everyone here to know that I was talking out my ass before," he announced. "Sergeant Gonzalez isn't just qualified to be a marksmanship instructor, she's probably the best shooter on this base. Hell, she might be the best shooter I've ever met. If any of you get the chance to train with her, consider yourselves lucky." The crowd's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Soldiers who had been uncertain about Maria's abilities now had concrete evidence of her skills, delivered in the most dramatic fashion possible. More importantly, Morrison's public acknowledgement and apology effectively ended the whisper campaign that had been undermining her authority. As the crowd began to disperse, discussing what they had witnessed and spreading the story throughout the base, Maria remained at the firing line, carefully cleaning Morrison's rifle and ensuring it was returned to him in perfect condition. It was a small gesture, but one that demonstrated the professionalism and respect for equipment that marked her as a true military professional. The confrontation was over, but the legend of Maria's 15 perfect shots was just beginning.
Within hours of the shooting demonstration, word had spread far beyond the confines of Range 7. The story of Maria's perfect performance under pressure was racing through Fort Bragg like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each retelling. By evening chow, she had allegedly hit targets at impossible distances, shot while blindfolded, or performed other feats that pushed the boundaries of physical possibility. But for those who had actually witnessed the event, no embellishment was necessary. What they had seen was authentic excellence under pressure, a display of marksmanship that combined technical skill with mental toughness in a way that left no doubt about Maria's qualifications or abilities. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation revealed interesting character dynamics within the unit. Morrison, to his credit, didn't just apologize and disappear. Over the following days, he became one of Maria's most vocal supporters, actively countering any remaining skepticism about her abilities with first-hand testimony about what he had witnessed. His transformation from antagonist to advocate was remarkable to observe, and it spoke to a fundamental decency beneath his initially hostile exterior. "I've been shooting for 20 years, he told anyone who would listen, and I've never seen anything like what Sergeant Gonzalez did with my rifle. 15 shots, 3 different distances, after running and doing push-ups, and every single round was exactly where she wanted it. That's not luck, that's not good equipment, that's pure skill." The institutional response to the incident was equally revealing. Major Patterson, the battalion commander, had heard about the demonstration within an hour of its conclusion. Rather than viewing it as a breach of protocol or an inappropriate public spectacle, he saw it as a valuable teaching moment and a vindication of the selection process that had brought Maria to Fort Bragg. Sometimes the best way to establish credibility is to demonstrate capability, he observed during a staff meeting. Sergeant Gonzalez handled a challenging situation with professionalism and skill. The result speaks for itself. Captain Williams, the company commander who had originally recommended Maria for the instructor position, felt a mixture of vindication and concern. He was pleased that her abilities had been so dramatically demonstrated, but he worried about the precedent of settling disputes through public competitions. "We can't have every disagreement resolved with shooting contests," he noted, but in this case, the challenge was directly related to professional competence, and the outcome effectively ended a situation that was becoming disruptive to unit cohesion. For Maria herself, the days following the demonstration brought a mix of satisfaction and adjustment. The constant attention was uncomfortable. She had always preferred to let her work speak for itself rather than seeking the spotlight. But she recognized that the very public nature of her vindication had benefits that extended beyond her personal situation. "Maybe other female soldiers won't have to go through what I went through," she confided to her roommate, Specialist Rodriguez. "Maybe now, when someone questions whether a woman belongs in a particular role, people will remember that performance matters more than assumptions."
The training atmosphere on the base improved dramatically. Soldiers who had previously been uncertain about Maria's credibility now approached her instruction with genuine respect and eagerness to learn. Her classes, which had sometimes felt tense due to underlying skepticism, became collaborative environments where students focused on improvement rather than testing their instructor's knowledge. Morrison himself became a regular attendee at Maria's advanced marksmanship sessions, approaching his own skill development with new humility and enthusiasm. The change in his attitude was so pronounced that other NCOs began commenting on it. "Rick's like a different person," observed Sergeant First Class Davis. "He used to know everything about everything. Now he actually listens when someone is teaching him something new." The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Morrison had been forced to confront his own biases and assumptions in a very public way, and the experience had clearly affected his approach to leadership and learning. He began incorporating Maria's teaching techniques into his own training sessions, crediting her methods and encouraging his soldiers to seek her instruction. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the demonstration was its effect on the base's culture around gender and competence. The story became part of Fort Bragg's oral tradition, told and retold in barracks, mess halls, and training areas. Each telling reinforced the message that performance was what mattered, that assumptions based on gender, age, or appearance were dangerous distractions from the real business of military effectiveness. Young female soldiers began approaching Maria for mentorship and advice, seeing in her success a roadmap for their own career development. Male soldiers who had harbored their own doubts about women in combat roles found themselves reconsidering their assumptions in light of what they had witnessed or heard about. The institutional memory of the military is long and powerful. Stories of exceptional performance become part of the culture, shaping expectations and attitudes for generations of soldiers who never personally witnessed the original events. Maria's demonstration was becoming one of those defining moments that would influence Fort Bragg's culture for years to come. But even as the immediate excitement died down and routine training resumed, the fundamental questions raised by the confrontation continued to resonate. How should military institutions handle disputes about competence and qualification? What role should public demonstration play in establishing credibility? How can the military ensure that all soldiers are evaluated based on performance rather than preconceptions?
3 weeks after the demonstration, Maria received an unexpected visitor in her office. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the post's deputy commander for training, had requested a private meeting to discuss what she termed lessons learned from recent events. Colonel Mitchell was a legend in her own right, one of the first women to serve in combat arms, with deployments spanning 3 decades and a reputation for straight talk and strategic thinking. Her presence in Maria's small instructor office was both intimidating and encouraging. "Sergeant Gonzalez," the colonel began, settling into the only spare chair in the cramped space. "What happened on Range 7 has implications that extend far beyond your immediate situation. I'd like to understand your perspective on how we might apply those lessons more broadly." Maria had been expecting some kind of official follow-up, but she hadn't anticipated involvement at the colonel's level. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking." "Let me be direct," Colonel Mitchell replied. "You faced a challenge to your professional credibility and responded in a way that not only vindicated your qualifications, but also created a teaching moment for the entire installation. The question is whether that approach can be systematized, made part of how we handle similar situations." The conversation that followed revealed the complexity of institutional change within military organizations. Colonel Mitchell explained that Fort Bragg, like military installations worldwide, was grappling with questions about integration, competence evaluation, and the cultural changes that came with evolving personnel policies. "We can mandate respect," she noted, "but we can't mandate belief. What you accomplished was different. You created genuine conviction among people who had been skeptical. That's rare and valuable." Maria found herself discussing not just her personal experience, but broader questions about training methodology, leadership development, and institutional culture.
Colonel Mitchell's questions were probing and sophisticated, clearly informed by extensive experience with organizational dynamics. The challenge, Colonel Mitchell continued, is that we can't have every competence dispute resolved through public demonstrations, but we also can't ignore the fact that your approach was remarkably effective at changing minds and attitudes. They discussed the development of more formal mentorship programs, structured opportunities for soldiers to demonstrate advanced skills, and protocols for addressing competence challenges that might arise in the future. What emerged from the conversation was a recognition that Maria's situation, while unique in its dramatic resolution, represented broader issues that required systematic attention. "I'd like to consider taking on some additional responsibilities," Colonel Mitchell said as their meeting concluded. "We're developing a new training program focused on advanced marksmanship and instructor development. Your experience, both technical and leadership, would be invaluable." The offer represented a significant career opportunity, but it also meant taking on visibility and responsibility that Maria hadn't necessarily sought. Her preference had always been to focus on the technical aspects of her job, perfecting her own skills and helping others develop theirs. But she was beginning to understand that her role had evolved beyond individual instruction. Over the following days, Maria found herself reflecting on the broader implications of her experience. The demonstration had resolved her immediate problem with Morrison, but it had also thrust her into a position of symbolic importance that came with its own challenges and opportunities. The soldiers she trained now approached her differently. There was more respect, certainly, but also higher expectations. They assumed that someone who could shoot as precisely as she had demonstrated would have insights into all aspects of military performance, from physical fitness to leadership techniques. "Sergeant Gonzalez," Private Johnson asked during a recent training session, "how do you stay so calm under pressure? Not just shooting pressure, but all kinds of stress." The question revealed how her reputation had expanded beyond marksmanship into broader areas of military competence. Students were seeking guidance on mental preparation, stress management, and performance optimization that went beyond the technical mechanics of accurate shooting. Maria found herself drawing on experiences from her deployment, her childhood training with her grandfather, and her years of competitive shooting to provide answers that addressed not just the immediate tactical questions, but the underlying psychological and philosophical issues that determined success in high-stress situations. "Pressure is information," she would tell her students. "It tells you what's important, what you need to focus on, what you can't afford to get wrong. The key is learning to use that information rather than being overwhelmed by it." These impromptu discussions were becoming as valuable as the formal marksmanship instruction. Students were learning not just how to shoot more accurately, but how to think more clearly about performance, preparation, and mental management under stress. The impact extended beyond individual soldiers to unit-level performance. Companies whose soldiers had trained with Maria began posting improved qualification scores, not just in marksmanship, but in overall military skills assessments. The confidence and mental discipline that she taught on the range were transferring to other areas of military performance.
Morrison, meanwhile, had become an informal case study in leadership transformation. His public acknowledgement of error and subsequent commitment to learning had impressed both his subordinates and his superiors. He was being considered for promotion and additional responsibilities based partly on his demonstrated ability to admit mistakes and adapt his approach. Rick Morrison used to be the guy who always had to be right, Sergeant First Class Davis observed. Now he's the guy who's always trying to get better. That's a hell of a change. And it happened because he had the courage to acknowledge when he was wrong. The transformation of Fort Bragg's training culture wasn't immediate or universal, but it was measurable. 6 months after Maria's demonstration, the base's overall marksmanship scores had improved by 12%, with particularly notable gains among units that had embraced her teaching methods and mental preparation techniques. More significantly, the number of formal complaints related to gender discrimination had dropped by 40%. While multiple factors contributed to this improvement, post commanders and equal opportunity officers noted that the dramatic nature of Maria's vindication had created a base-wide conversation about competence, respect, and professional evaluation that was influencing behavior at all levels. Stories matter in military culture, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, a sociologist who studied military institutions. When a story becomes part of the organizational narrative, it shapes expectations and behaviors for years afterward. Sergeant Gonzalez's demonstration became a story about merit overcoming prejudice, and that's a powerful cultural message. The broader implications extended beyond Fort Bragg to other military installations and even civilian organizations dealing with similar integration challenges. Maria's approach, responding to challenge with demonstrated competence, was being studied and adapted in various contexts. But success brought its own complications. Media attention had discovered the story, and Maria found herself dealing with interview requests, feature article proposals, and speaking invitations that threatened to distract from her primary mission of training soldiers. She had to develop strategies for managing public attention while maintaining professional effectiveness. "I didn't sign up to be a poster child," she confided to Colonel Mitchell during one of their regular mentoring sessions. "I just want to be a good soldier and help other people become better soldiers." Colonel Mitchell, who had navigated similar challenges throughout her own career, provided practical advice about managing public attention while maintaining professional effectiveness. "The visibility comes with the territory when you achieve something exceptional," she noted. "The key is using that platform to advance the mission, rather than letting it become a distraction." The speaking engagements and interviews, when Maria chose to accept them, became opportunities to share lessons about training methodology, mental preparation, and organizational culture rather than simply recounting the dramatic events of Range 7. She used her platform to advocate for evidence-based evaluation, intensive training, and institutional support for all soldiers, regardless of background. "Excellence isn't about proving yourself once," she would tell audiences. "It's about developing systems and habits that produce consistent high performance over time." What happened on that range was the result of thousands of hours of preparation, not one moment of inspiration. Her emphasis on preparation and systematic development resonated with military and civilian audiences alike. The principles she articulated, rigorous training, mental discipline, objective evaluation, and continuous improvement, were applicable far beyond marksmanship or military contexts. Morrison's parallel journey had become equally instructive for leadership development programs. His transformation from antagonist to advocate was being used as a case study in military leadership courses, demonstrating how effective leaders respond to new information and acknowledge mistakes. "Pride and leadership are often in conflict," Morrison would tell junior NCOs in leadership development sessions. "Real leaders care more about mission success than personal ego." When I was wrong about Sergeant Gonzalez, admitting that mistake made me a better leader and made our unit more effective. The institutional response to these developments was carefully measured, but increasingly supportive. Fort Bragg's command structure recognized that they had witnessed something valuable, not just an individual demonstration of skill, but a case study in organizational culture change that could be replicated and scaled. New training protocols were being developed that incorporated Maria's mental preparation techniques alongside traditional marksmanship instruction. Instructor development programs were being expanded to include modules on handling challenges to authority, managing stress in teaching environments, and creating inclusive training atmospheres. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on the next generation of soldiers entering the system. Young recruits arriving at Fort Bragg were entering an environment where the story of Maria's demonstration was part of the institutional culture, creating expectations about competence, respect, and opportunity that would shape their entire military experience.
When new soldiers hear that story, Captain Williams observed, they understand that performance is what matters here. It doesn't matter what you look like or where you come from. If you can do the job, you'll get the respect and opportunities you've earned. The ripple effects extended into civilian communities as well. Veterans who had witnessed or heard about the demonstration carried the story into post-military careers, spreading its lessons about merit-based evaluation and organizational culture change into corporate, educational, and community contexts. Female veterans in particular found the story useful in their own professional development and advocacy efforts. Maria's approach, responding to challenge with demonstrated excellence, became a model for handling workplace discrimination and professional skepticism in various fields. "It's not enough to be right," one veteran explained to a group of young women entering STEM careers. "Sometimes you have to prove you're right in a way that's so clear and public that nobody can deny it afterward." That's what Sergeant Gonzalez did, and it changed everything for everyone who came after her. The demonstration on Range 7 had evolved from a personal confrontation into a teachable moment with implications that extended far beyond its original context, influencing military culture, leadership development, and organizational change theory in ways that its participants could never have anticipated.
2 years after the demonstration, Maria received notification of her selection for promotion to Sergeant First Class, along with orders to attend the Army's Advanced Marksmanship Instructor course at Fort Benning. The promotion and assignment represented recognition not just of her technical skills, but of her leadership potential and institutional impact. The selection was notable for another reason. She would be the youngest soldier ever chosen for the Advanced Instructor program, and one of only 3 women to participate in the course's 15-year history. Her selection file contained evaluations that consistently highlighted not just her marksmanship abilities, but her capacity to teach, mentor, and inspire improved performance in others. "Sergeant Gonzalez represents the future of military instruction," wrote Colonel Mitchell in her evaluation. "She combines technical excellence with teaching ability and institutional leadership in a way that produces measurable improvements in unit performance and organizational culture." The notification arrived during a particularly busy period in Maria's career. She was simultaneously managing the Advanced Marksmanship program at Fort Bragg, developing curriculum for the new instructor training protocols, and serving as a mentor for junior soldiers throughout the installation. Her typical day included range instruction, classroom teaching, individual counseling sessions, and administrative duties that would challenge any seasoned NCO. But she had also learned to manage the ongoing attention that came with her reputation. The story of Range 7 had become part of military folklore, but Maria had developed strategies for focusing conversations on professional development rather than personal drama. When new soldiers asked about the demonstration, she redirected their interest toward training techniques and performance improvement. What matters isn't what happened 2 years ago. What matters is what you're going to accomplish with the training you receive here. My job is to help you become the best shooter and the best soldier you can be. This approach had proven effective in maintaining training focus while building on the cultural changes that had resulted from her confrontation with Morrison. The range environment at Fort Bragg had evolved into one of the most productive and inclusive training atmospheres in the military, with soldiers from other installations requesting transfer opportunities specifically to train under Maria's program. Morrison himself had been promoted to Master Sergeant and assigned as a senior instructor in a different specialty, but he remained at Fort Bragg and maintained regular contact with Maria's program. Their professional relationship had evolved into one of mutual respect and collaboration, with Morrison often referring advanced students to Maria's courses and supporting her curriculum development efforts. Quote, "People ask me about what happened between us, and I tell them it was the most important learning experience of my military career. Not just about shooting, but about leadership, humility, and recognizing excellence wherever you find it." End quote.
The institutional memory of their confrontation had solidified into a teaching tool used throughout the military education system. Leadership courses at various levels incorporated the incident as a case study in conflict resolution, bias recognition, and performance-based evaluation. The story was being used to train officers, NCOs, and civilian supervisors in techniques for creating merit-based organizational cultures. But the most significant ongoing impact was visible in the daily operations of military training programs across multiple installations. The principles that Maria had demonstrated, objective evaluation, intensive preparation, and professional response to challenge, were being incorporated into standard operating procedures for instructor development and student assessment. The Gonzalez method, as some instructors informally called it, emphasized creating training environments where competence was demonstrated rather than assumed, where challenges were met with evidence rather than authority, and where excellence was recognized regardless of the source. These principles were producing measurable improvements in training outcomes and unit cohesion. Female soldiers entering the military were benefiting from cultural changes that traced directly back to Maria's demonstration. While individual instances of bias and discrimination hadn't been eliminated, the overall environment was more supportive of evidence-based evaluation and merit-driven advancement. Young women in military occupational specialties where they were underrepresented found more mentorship opportunities and fewer assumptions about their capabilities. Quote, "When I got to my first duty station, I was worried about proving myself as a female soldier, but my chain of command was more interested in what I could do than what I looked like. That's not an accident. That's the result of cultural changes that people like Sergeant Gonzalez made possible." End quote. The academic community had also taken notice of the incident and its aftermath. Military sociologists, organizational psychologists, and leadership researchers were studying the case as an example of how individual actions could catalyze institutional change. Several universities had incorporated the story into their business and leadership curricula as an example of effective response to workplace challenges. Dr. Foster, who had been tracking the long-term impacts of the demonstration, published a comprehensive study that identified specific mechanisms by which Maria's actions had influenced organizational culture. Quote, "Individual excellence, publicly demonstrated, can shift institutional norms in ways that formal policy changes often cannot. The key factors appeared to be the objective nature of the demonstration, the public acknowledgement of error by the challenger, and the systematic incorporation of lessons learned into institutional practices." End quote. As Maria prepared for her assignment to Fort Benning and the advanced instructor course, she reflected on how dramatically her career and the broader military culture had evolved since that morning on Range 7. What had begun as a personal challenge to her professional competence had become a catalyst for institutional change that was still generating positive effects years later.
5 years had passed since that transformative morning on Range 7, and Sergeant First Class Maria Gonzalez found herself standing in front of a different kind of target, a classroom full of instructor candidates at the U.S. Army Marksmanship Unit at Fort Benning. Her students represented the best shooters from installations across the globe, selected for their technical skills and potential to become the next generation of military marksmanship instructors. Excellence under pressure, she told the assembled candidates, isn't about having perfect conditions. It's about performing at your highest level regardless of what's happening around you. Today, we're going to explore what that really means. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now teaching the very principles she had been forced to demonstrate that day when Morrison challenged her credibility. But the perspective that came with experience and institutional responsibility had transformed her understanding of that confrontation from a personal trial into a professional opportunity that had shaped her entire career. Her reputation had evolved far beyond the dramatic story of 15 perfect shots. She was now recognized as one of the military's foremost experts on performance psychology, stress management, and instructor development. Her research on shooting under pressure had been published in military journals and incorporated into training programs throughout the armed forces. But she never forgot the lessons of that morning at Fort Bragg. Every time a student faced doubt or challenge, every time someone questioned whether excellence was achievable under adverse conditions, Maria drew on the experience that had taught her that competence and character were best demonstrated through action rather than argument. "The most important shot you'll ever take," she would tell her students, "is the one where everything is on the line and everyone is watching. That's when you discover what you're really made of." Morrison had retired from the Army the previous year, but not before achieving the rank of First Sergeant and earning recognition as one of the most effective senior NCOs. His transformation following the demonstration had become a model for military leadership development, and he often returned to the installation as a guest speaker on topics of personal growth and organizational culture. During his retirement ceremony, he had specifically requested that Maria be present, and his remarks to the assembled crowd included a detailed account of their confrontation and its impact on his understanding of leadership and professional development. 25 years ago, he had said, "I thought I knew everything there was to know about military competence. Then I met a young sergeant who taught me that real knowledge means being willing to learn, real strength means acknowledging when you're wrong, and real leadership means recognizing excellence wherever you find it." The institutional changes that had begun with Maria's demonstration had continued to evolve and expand. Fort Bragg's training programs were now considered among the most innovative and effective in the military, with representatives from allied nations regularly visiting to study their methods. The base had become a model for evidence-based instruction and inclusive training environments. More broadly, the story of Range 7 had entered military legend alongside other tales of individual excellence that shaped organizational culture across generations. It was taught in leadership courses, referenced in policy discussions, and cited in academic studies of institutional change. But for Maria, the most meaningful impact was visible in the daily experiences of soldiers who benefited from training environments that emphasized competence over assumptions. "What we accomplished that day," she reflected during a recent interview, "wasn't really about proving my individual abilities. It was about establishing principles that would benefit every soldier who came after us." The demonstration lasted 15 minutes, but the cultural changes it catalyzed are still producing positive effects years later. Her current assignment at Fort Benning represented the culmination of a career trajectory that had been fundamentally altered by those 15 shots. She was now responsible for training the instructors who would teach marksmanship throughout the military, ensuring that the principles of excellence, objectivity, and inclusive evaluation would be carried forward to future generations of soldiers. The advanced instructor course she now taught incorporated not just technical marksmanship skills, but modules on performance psychology, stress management, conflict resolution, and organizational leadership. Students learned to shoot with exceptional accuracy, but they also learned to teach, mentor, and lead in ways that brought out the best in others regardless of background or initial skepticism. Sergeant Gonzalez changed how we think about demonstrating competence, observed General Patricia Collins, the current commander of the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. Her approach, responding to challenge with exceptional performance, has become a model for military professionals at all levels. But more importantly, her long-term commitment to institutional improvement has created lasting changes that benefit the entire force. As Maria concluded her lecture to the instructor candidates, she looked at faces that reflected the diversity of the modern military, men and women from different backgrounds, ethnicities, and experiences, united by their commitment to excellence and their potential to shape the next generation of soldiers. "Your technical skills brought you here," she told them, "but your character and commitment will determine your impact. Remember that every student you teach, every standard you set, every example you provide contributes to the culture we're building together. Make it count." The story that had begun with a confrontation on a military firing range had evolved into a legacy of institutional change that would influence military training for decades to come. Maria's 15 perfect shots had proven more than individual competence. They had demonstrated the power of excellence to overcome prejudice, the importance of objective evaluation, and the potential for individual actions to create lasting organizational transformation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.